Hi, everyone. So our last video dealt with the election of 1860, where Abraham Lincoln wins the Electoral College and wins the vote for presidency. It was a four-man race, if you want to call it that way, and he beat out Breckinridge, even though none of the states of the South carried Lincoln. It was a very sectional decision. So South Carolina secedes, and other states soon follow. And then when Lincoln was sworn in, he gave a speech really saying how he hoped to preserve the Union, but he will defend government territories within Confederate land if necessary. And that meant protecting Fort Sumner, which was in South Carolina, and basically the Civil War begins. What I want to take a few minutes today is to go over both the advantages and disadvantages that each side had, the Union and the Confederacy. You probably refer to them more often as the North or the South. So the Confederacy, we all know they lost, but when we know they lost, we often don't realize just how many advantages they had, and in some ways, just how amazing it was that the Union did win despite the Confederate advantages. So some of their advantages was they had very strong popular support. The people were very pro-South, if you want to call it that way, and were very much in favor of leaving the Union. This image here is of a call to arms to people actually after the war already began, after New Orleans was fought. I do want to note that there were Southern Unionists. There were people in the South who supported the Union cause and did not want to secede. The Southerners often used a throwback term from the Revolutionary War and called them loyalists, which is sort of an insult because the people that supported the British in the Revolutionary War were loyalists. So they would call them things like that. In fact, 22,000 people from Virginia and what is also now West Virginia fought for the Union. 10,000 from Arkansas fought for the Union. But as I said, the support for the leaving the Union was very strong. There's no real way to actually know what percentage because they didn't vote on it. It wasn't a public vote, should we leave or not? But you can get an idea from the delegates and how they voted. So probably the strongest leading one was Mississippi, where 85% of the delegates wanted immediate secession. The Southerners also were fighting unfamiliar territory because most of the war was fought in the South as opposed to the North, so they knew the area. Culturally, the people of the Confederacy also had more experience with guns, horses, things like that. That's not to say that people of the North didn't, but if you had to compare one to the two, the North had much more experience with that. It was sort of part of their culture, if you will. The South had better military training facilities. Think of all the battles that were already fought down south, whether it was the War of 1812 or the Mexican War, so they had those available. They were defending their homes, and if you're fighting to defend your home as compared to fight to attack a home, right? When you're defending your home, you usually fight a little bit harder. They also had superior military leaders, which was one of their biggest advantages. So I'm going to take just a minute to briefly go over some of their leaders. This does not make me pro-Confederate or anything like that, but I just want you to be aware of some of them, especially now that we hear so much since this past year about taking down statues and all that sort of stuff. So, of course, we have Robert E. Lee. He was alive from 1807 to 1870, and he was the USMA class, which is the U.S. Military Academy class of 1829. He graduated second in his class, and eventually, as he did well in the war, he became the general of the Confederate States Army. He opposed secession. He was if it was right before the Civil War, he was not a fan of the state succeeding. And in fact, Lincoln, because he asked him to lead his army, but he resigned from the U.S. Army to join the Confederate forces once Virginia seceded. And he was named the commander-in-chief of all the Confederate armies in 1865. And he's also known not just for his military strategies and his leadership, but as the one that did surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. You've probably heard of Stonewall Jackson. He was from Virginia, which is now West Virginia, the USMA class of 1846, and he was a lieutenant general. Now, you might see from the years that he died young. That's because he died in the Civil War. To show you how complex the war was and the issues over slavery, he sort of personally opposed slavery, but then since his culture, if you will, and his state sort of supported it, he sort of justified it in biblical terms. Did the Bible support slavery kind of thing? He thought, well, maybe God does will it. But he thought that it was important to educate slaves and freed African Americans, which actually was against the law in many southern states. And as you see, he actually began teaching Sunday schools in Virginia, which was against the law at the time. And the story is that many slaves actually sort of begged for him to purchase them, if you will, because they knew his treatment of them would be kinder than of the average slave owner. He won his nickname of Stonewall Jackson at the Battle of Bull Run because the Confederate Brigadier General B made a comment, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." Never really known to this day if that was a compliment or an insult. He was injured in battle. He hurt his left arm. And Lee, knowing how important Jackson was, is reported to say, "Jackson has lost his left arm. I have lost my right," showing just how much he relied on Jackson. Back in the Civil War, if you lost a limb, that probably meant you were going to die, right? Today, people unfortunately still lose still lose limbs in war, but they usually survive. Not here, not with the risk of infection and all those sorts of things. And he died not long after at Chancellorsville. I'm going to give you one more, James Longstreet, because he's one who, if you look at as a parent to Stonewall Jackson, was pretty amazing as well. He was also a USMA graduate class of 1842 and also a lieutenant general in the Confederacy. His strategy was Old War Horse, which is because he was known for his defense strategies and his tactics. He resigned from the U.S. Army in 1861 to join the Confederacy. He was wounded at the Battle of the Wilderness, and just like Jackson, this was also by friendly fire. He had a bullet through his neck and through his right shoulder. And as he was hurt, he basically gave orders for someone else who now he wanted to take command. And supposedly he was like bleeding and foaming from the mouth as he did this. Interestingly enough, also, where he was shot was just 4 miles to the east of where Stonewall Jackson was shot 1 year and 4 days earlier. He did later return to leadership, but he did have a paralyzed arm for the rest of his life. He eventually died in 1904 of pneumonia. And post-war, he actually received death threats from Southerners because eventually he joined the Republican Party, and which they didn't like that. And they also didn't like the fact that he converted to Catholicism, which was sort of a Yankee trait. A lot more Catholics in the North as opposed to the South. But the Confederacy also had disadvantages. They had a much smaller population if you figure that 1/3 of the population was enslaved people who would not be soldiers fighting for the Confederacy. There's a little typo there, but they also had fewer factories that impacted their economy and also impacted how many supplies they could have. You think of the South as farms and plantations, but they actually produced less food than the North. They had fewer railroad miles, so it was therefore hard to move troops and supplies. They had fewer ships. And also with their railroad lines, if you look here, all of their lines didn't even connect. So it's not like you could get on one rail line and necessarily get to another one. And they were also different gauges, which meant if you were a train on a green track, you couldn't go on a train on a red track here. They had fewer ships. And some people will also argue that Jefferson Davis was a disadvantage if you don't really agree with his style of leadership. So I spoke a lot about their leaders, so I'm going to wait to the next video to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the North. So I will pick that up next